Well, good morning, you guys. We are starting off with a bang with Mark Twain, and now moving down the buffet line of American literature, we get to William Dean Howells, known affectionately as the Dean of American Letters. He's probably best known for his novel, The Rise of Silas Lapham, and if you are lucky enough to be an English major, chances are you'll probably have an opportunity to read this novel. We're going to run through a few slides together. When I think of William Dean Howells, I'm always thinking that he's a Midwestern guy. He was from Ohio, never really had a lot of formal education, and like many of his contemporaries, and we see this in this generation of writers after the Civil War, we see a lot of writers, you guys, who enter into the world of publishing and into the world of writing, not through formal education, but rather through journalism. So we see lots of writers who are working as editors, working as reporters, and sort of make that transition into writing literature. I think very different than the previous generation. If we think about that first half of the 19th century, a lot of those voices that we're familiar with, people like Cooper, Hawthorne, Emerson, Thoreau, all of those guys were usually formally educated in one of the prestigious universities. But with the Civil War, things change, and so we see writers, as I said, coming into the profession of writing through journalism, and Howells is certainly no exception. He made a pilgrimage to Boston in 1860, and while he was there, he was received by James Russell Lowell and Oliver Wendell Holmes. These two guys represent sort of that Brahmin, New England upper crust caste, sort of that New England literati. And it really does signal a changing of the guards, because they sort of hand off the baton, figuratively speaking, to William Dean Howells, who then begins a long run as the editor of the Atlantic Monthly. He did some other interesting things as well. He wrote a campaign biography for Abraham Lincoln, and was rewarded for that effort by receiving a pretty cushy consulship in Italy, I believe. So he works for the Atlantic Monthly. He does become a very good friend with Mark Twain, and in fact, we could argue that it's really William Dean Howells who introduces Mark Twain to the world of the literary giants back east, because at this point Mark Twain is out west. He's notorious or celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County. He's sort of known as a Western wit, and it's Howells who introduces him and invites him really to come back and meet and actually take place in the birthday celebration for, I think it was Whittier. I'll have to double check that, but there's a whole story that goes along with that, and I'll fill you in on that later. I'll post something I think I already have posted something in our course folder for him. He was really, though, known for really more as a critic, and for his ideas regarding realism. And he was still far more genteel and conservative than later writers that we'll get to in a little bit in the next unit, naturalism. But really, the idea with William Dean Howells, and that really the saying that he's most famous for with regarding his definition of what realism is, is this quote where he says, "It's realism is nothing more or nothing less than the truthful treatment of material." And so he becomes sort of the major advocate and spokesperson for this aesthetic, or what we might call this literary style. And if we think back on the first generation, the first half of the 19th century, the Romantics, remember they were very dreamy, and they really extolled the virtues of the intuition and imagination, and so we could have these really fanciful tales. If you think about the Scarlet Letter, or if you think about the novels of James Fenimore Cooper or Edgar Allan Poe, right? Let me see who else would be a really good example. Washington Irving, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle. These are tales that are not rooted in reality, right? I mean, they are symbolic, they are fanciful. And so, again, and really the seminal event of the 19th century, let's not forget this, is the Civil War. And with the Civil War, with its coming, with its bloodshed, and with its going, the whole complexion of American life changes. And so what was esteemed and valued at the first half of the century, particularly by writers and artists and intellectuals, changed fundamentally and significantly, and Howells is really at the helm of that. So here, the most important contribution of Howells is this idea of realistic fiction. And so he helped shape the career of young writers who were coming up and submitting their stories to the Atlantic Monthly for publication. And again, we have a definition here, nothing more or less than the truthful treatment of material. Now, let's push pause here for a second, and we can have a little sidebar or double click on this notion of Howells's aesthetic ideal. It's somewhat biased and somewhat limited, really, because when we consider the fact that he chooses Jane Austen as, quote, the most truthful of writers. Jane Austen was that English novelist, right? The Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility. She really wasn't that realistic of a writer, right? She had very contrived plots. They were very sentimental. Howells was later criticized by the next sort of generation that was coming along, people like Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, Theodore Dreiser. And I'm going to give you this other little quote of his that I think really does sort of illuminate, again, his limitations as a literary critic, where he says that, or he asserts that American fiction should only explore, quote, the smiling aspects of life. Well, there's something significantly limited about that, isn't there? Because we know that as human beings, we experience a lot of things that don't cause us to smile, right? Life is ugly. There is a darkness to the species and how we treat one another. And Howells was just very sensitive to that. And I'll tell you why I think it is. I think Howells knew that the American readership, in other words, the people who were consuming literature, were primarily women, young women, who had leisure to do so. Because young men, and again, think about the time, right? It's the Industrial Revolution, it's the Civil War. Young men are out there trying to, gold was discovered, right, in 1849. We have the Transcontinental Railroad. So young men are not really consumed with reading literature for their leisure time, right? So Howells was concerned then about how American life would be presented in its literature, particularly to European and English audiences as well. And so, again, we see, he says, our novelists therefore concern themselves with the more smiling aspects of life, which are the more American, and seek the universal in the individual rather than social interests. And again, I mentioned that The Rise of Silas Lapham is really the novel that he's best known for. But let me tell you what, this story, Editha, when I teach this one in class, we have so much conversation and fantastic give and take and exchange about what this little story reveals in it. But as you read through it, I've got some discussion questions here. You don't have to answer these, but I want you to be thinking about them. And I will say this, if you look at number 3, it's a brilliant story for this aspect of fiction and this literary period known as realism. And the question I've got here is, in what ways is Howells' story Editha one that presents a clashing or a conflict of romanticism and realism? Okay, not going to give it away, but as you read through this story, I think this is really the gist of what Howells' message is in this story. So I'm going to sort of tease you with that and ask you to consider that. Particularly if you look at the ending of the story, focus on that too. The last 5 paragraphs, when Editha is back and she's sitting there being drawn or sketched by an artist, Howells is sort of playing with the idea of art and how it should function. Should it be embellished and romanticized, or should it be nothing more, nothing less than the truthful treatment of material, as he asserts? Anyways, it's really a great story, and I think you're going to enjoy it. I'm just seeing if there's anything else on these discussion questions that, some takeaways from the story. George is an interesting character. I like his name, Gearson. He is a cog or a gear in a rather big wheel. This wheel that he finds himself caught up in, and his ultimate fate. Again, not going to tease the story or tease the ending or spoil the ending. I'm going to let you guys figure that out. But listen, I'm just glad we had a couple moments to talk about who Howells was, why he was important. Again, that theory of realism, that definition, his taking over the Atlantic Monthly, his advocacy and support for a generation of writers, people like Twain, people like Henry James, and still, even though he himself was conservative and very traditional still in a lot of ways, he was astute enough to let younger writers do what they wanted to do. People like Stephen Crane, Frank Norris, Theodore Dreiser, Jack London, these naturalist writers who we're going to get to in the next unit, who are really responding in some ways against, or maybe even trying to recalibrate what realism is. Because remember, we have Howells here saying that American literature should only be about the smiling aspects of life. Well, again, that's not very comprehensive or not very realistic at all, is it, right? Anyways, I'm glad we had this time. If you have any questions, just let me know. Post it on the discussion board. Looking forward to your response on this story. All right, you guys have a great day.